Titanic. She weighed just over 52,000 tons, travelled no more than 3,000 nautical miles in her lifetime, held 4 more additional lifeboats than legally required, just to be on the safe side, and 83% of the public to this day believe that Rose was a Mahogany Hogging Mahogany Hogger. For well over a century, Titanic has captured the heart, soul and imagination of millions of people around the world. There is something indescribably mesmerising about the world's most famous nautical tragedy. Over time, a cocktail of fictional stories, urban legends, true accounts, wild imaginations, and the unknown can clearly cloud our judgment when looking at her story. I've been shocked to discover that in some cases, what I have considered to be fact for many years has actually turned out to be simply untrue, and vice versa with regards to what I considered myths. So let's try and create a distinct line between fact and fiction, like a teenage haircut in the 90s. So throw on your best Ben Sherman shirt, slap on some dupe, and follow me. This is Titanic Deep Dive.
Is known for its grunge music.
I was simply not prepared for the amount of fake information and wild conspiracies around the Titanic and the White Star Line. I even highly suspect that there are many articles on YouTube and other platforms that completely fabricate the existence of some conspiracy theories in an attempt to get anybody Titanic obsessed to click on their channel. So let's start off at a time when the internet simply couldn't confuse and contort facts like an interview with Prince Andrew. In the early 90s, as a young child I remember slowly flicking through my parents' book collection whilst lying on the sitting room floor. Although I couldn't read, I would look at the pictures and study them for hours. For some strange reason, I was always drawn to the haunted and beautiful images of shipwrecks, from 2 books in particular, one book of the Bismarck and the other Titanic. I would repeatedly glance between the old grainy black and white photos to the modern blue and grey coloured pictures and illustrations of the slowly decaying vessels being inevitably consumed by the unforgiving sea. Although I was too young to fully appreciate the fascinating story behind both doomed ships, the contrast between them both being alive, containing life, full of purpose and pride, power, adventure and spirit, to silent, broken, still, unnatural, cold and lonely structures rotting on the dark sea bed was not wasted on me. I was 12 years old when I heard my first conspiracy about the Titanic. The year was 1998 and the multi-million-dollar blockbuster film Titanic had just been released in the UK earlier that year. It was a school day, and although I found myself in most lessons zoned out, bored and uninterested, Mr. Woods suddenly started to discuss the Titanic, and this instantly perked my interest. I was slightly confused because it wasn't a history lesson, but regardless, the teacher told the story of the cursed mummy. It was 1889 and an archaeologist had just discovered a tomb in the Luxor temple in Egypt. When opening the tomb, they discovered the sarcophagus of a high priestess, Amun-Ra. 3 Egyptian workers approached the coffin, but when they attempted to remove the lid, the 3,000-year-old dust seeped out of the sarcophagus and into the lungs of the workers, killing them almost instantly. Because of this incident, the Egyptian workers refused to set foot in the temple as they were convinced the mummy was cursed. 2 days later, 4 wealthy Englishmen arrived at the temple, completing their tour of the various Egyptian temples and tombs. Wanting to acquire a souvenir of their trip, they asked the archaeologist if they could purchase any sculpture or artifact found in the temple. Although it was forbidden to sell any of the items to members of the public, they did agree for them to remove the sarcophagus of the priestess, as they desperately needed the Egyptian workers to commence work again. Excited by the new purchase, they agreed a transaction date, retired back to their hotel to celebrate and to arrange money transfers.
Bloody good show, Jack.
I've always wanted one of those. Some quiche Lorraine.
However, when the date arrived, only 3 of the men showed up. According to a member of hotel staff, the missing Englishman had been seen walking deliriously into the desert and was never seen again.
Is that you, Mummy?
Despite this slight setback, the 3 remaining men paid helpers to have the sarcophagus removed from the temple, where one of the gentlemen injured his leg in the process. Days later, the wound became gangrenous and swollen, and later needed to be amputated.
Oh, bollocks.
When arriving back into England, another one of the men received news that his bank had collapsed,
What happened to my money?
leaving him in complete financial ruin. Now desperate to get rid of the priestess Amun-Ra, he arranged for a London entrepreneur to purchase the sarcophagus in cash.
Finally.
However, after carrying out the transaction, he was unfortunately beaten up, mugged, and died a few days later from his injuries. The entrepreneur later donated the Egyptian mummy to the British Museum after 3 members of his family were seriously injured in a train accident. When offloading the sarcophagus into the museum courtyard, the brakes gave way on the vehicle and crashed into a worker, killing him instantly. During her time at the museum, the night guards would often hear clawing and crying coming from the coffin, and visitors would often walk into the room to find artifacts near and around the sarcophagus broken and damaged. After a guard was found dead at the museum one morning, they arranged to move the priestess down to the basement. However, when 2 other members of staff became fatally ill, they agreed to sell the mummy to a wealthy American archaeologist, keeping only the sarcophagus lid to display at the museum. So the mummy was boxed up and taken to berth 44 at Southampton Dock, where she was loaded onto the RMS Titanic. I remember picking up my blue generic Umbro rucksack, pressing play on my Walkman and walking out of school with the Offspring's Americana album invading my ears, and for whatever reason the story tattooed itself onto my brain. So back then you couldn't just go home and search it on the internet. Although this was the same year Google was created, it would take me until I was in my late teens to actually sit down on my home computer and actively look up the story. And although the cursed mummy is a load of beaver dung, the story of how it became to be is an interesting tale within itself. We know the story is work of fiction because we know the author, a man called William Thomas Stead. He was a British newspaper editor and a pioneer of investigative journalism, which made him a controversial figure of his day. Stead boarded the Titanic for a visit to the United States to take part in a peace congress at Mahogany Hall at the request of President William Taft. The night before Titanic struck the iceberg, Stead was dining with his fellow passengers at the captain's table, as he did every evening on board the ship. During the 11-course meal, Stead would often entertain the captain's table with exciting, spooky and whimsical stories and anecdotes. Survivors who also dined at the captain's table detailed the journalist's story about the cursed mummy. One passenger even felt the need to ask Captain Smith if it was a true story. The captain explained with a laugh that there was no realistic way a mummy could have made it aboard the Titanic without his prior knowledge. Also, there was no record of the sarcophagus on board the Titanic according to the cargo logs. During the sinking, witnesses detailed seeing Stead helping several women and children into the lifeboats in an act typical of his generosity, courage and humanity. He also gave his life jacket to another passenger. A later sighting of Stead had him clinging to a raft until eventually the cold took its hold and he let go, and his body was never recovered. Since that night, however, the cursed mummy has echoed and whispered through the decades like Chinese whispers, and is still very much alive today in the form of hundreds and thousands of different variations of the fictional tale. You may be interested to know that the priestess Amun-Ra was not an invention of Stead's imagination, and in fact the painted wooden lid is very much true and available to see at the British Museum today. Although this must be my favourite story to come from the Titanic, I was really surprised when conducting my research at how many stories and tales surround the doomed ocean liner. Some are interesting tales, some are very much worthy of investigating. Some conspiracies are just very uninventive, unrealistic, and nobody believes them, just like a royal prince attending their daughter's birthday party at Pizza Express. And others are just preposterous, in my view at least. And as usual, there is simply not enough time to cover everything that I've researched in this one episode. But there will be a part 2 to cover this off, so don't sweat. However, in the time remaining, let's try and cover off as many as we can. As legend has it, this story began during the construction of Titanic at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. During the weeks and months, a message was spread around the hundreds of workers detailing that the ship was a bad omen. Word had got out that the hull number allocated to the Titanic, which was 390904, which when written in longhand and viewed through the reflection of a mirror, spelled no Pope. This was enough for workers to down tool and refuse to work on her until the number had been changed. After some reassurance and persuasion, convincing the workers that it was just a product of coincidence, they eventually continued working on the ship, regretting doing so when they found out of the ship's demise. Although this sounds like something out of a Stephen King novel, it only takes the slightest amount of effort to blow away the dust revealing the truth. First of all, this number was definitely not allocated to the Titanic's hull. In fact, the only numbers that were given to her that I'm aware of were the portrait designation number, which was 131428, and her shipyard number, which was 401. And secondly, nearly every worker working at the Harland and Wolff was Protestant and not Catholic. If anything, the bad omen would have been due to the fact that Titanic, like all of her sister ships, was not christened in the usual and traditional nautical manner, as this was against the White Star Line's policy. This conspiracy simply doesn't make sense. The theory details how a U-boat fired a missile at Titanic, sinking her that night. Theories suggest that there is no hard evidence that an iceberg was even witnessed, as well as passengers detailing an explosion being heard from the belly of the ship. They also explain that passengers and crew described seeing a light in the distance, and theorists believe that this was a U-boat rising to the surface to get a front row seat of the famous ship's end. We start off debunking this theory by looking at submarines in 1912. The technology was in its infancy, and there wasn't a U-boat built at the time that could have carried out that sort of journey. Also, firing a missile at a ship travelling at approximately 23 knots back then would have been a very tall order. Even with today's technology, it is not an easy task. Furthermore, what was the motive? During this peacetime era, there would have been no logical reason for sinking the largest passenger liner in the world, and even if the bold attack had taken place, I'm pretty sure the terrorists would have made themselves very much known. Theorists are correct when they say that passengers did see a light in the distance whilst the Titanic was sinking. It was well established that this was in fact the SS California, which was in a position to have saved most, if not all, passengers on board Titanic that night. However, the crew were blissfully unaware that the world's most famous ocean liner was in trouble. And this is a whole tragic story within itself. I highly recommend reading the book Titanic on Trial by Nick Compton. This book details actual statements from that night, detailing accounts from passengers and crew who survived the sinking, as well as crew on board the Carpathia and California. It really is a true eye-opener reading all the human errors that contributed towards the sinking, as well as the delay to the rescue operation. The statements reveal the heroic and brave souls, the tragic and helpless individuals, and the selfish and greedy. I'll link a description to this book in the details below. Going back to this theory and making a final point, not only did passengers and crew witness seeing and hearing an iceberg, but also damning evidence of this has been brought up from the wreckage in the form of rocks found on board and around the Titanic. After these rocks were studied, we understand that they originated from Greenland. Icebergs would commonly carry large rocks and boulders from when they're formed thousands of years ago, and it's now accepted that the rocks were dislodged during the impact that night, and there is no strong argument that I have seen justifies their existence on board and around the wreckage. I haven't forgotten about the passengers and crew who heard a large explosion coming from the depths of the ship. However, this is something I will be discussing in a later episode, as this ties up with another theory I want to look into. However, regarding submarines sinking the Titanic, to me, this is well and truly sunk. The final theory, which I wish to discuss in this episode, is arguably the most famous and widely believed conspiracy of them all. If you haven't seen my first introductory episode, I do touch on this theory, the reasons why I believe certain evidence isn't real. I do recommend you watch it, and I will leave a link at the end, because I do highlight certain points which I won't be covering again in this episode. I do want to cover this again because I did receive a couple of emails and personal messages detailing the reasons why this theory must be true. And that's why I'm happy to slap on my mask and snorkel and dive straight back into this conspiracy, the Olympic swap. For those of you who are unaware of the conspiracy, I shall relay the basics. Harland and Wolff built two identical ships for the White Star Line, one called Olympic and the other Titanic. A third ship, Britannic, was to follow in later years. They were built next to each other, and the Olympic was completed and ready for service on the 31st of May 1911. She had a series of mishaps, including a collision with a tugboat in New York, as well as the HMS Hawke colliding with the liner in Southampton, causing a serious amount of damage to her starboard side. It took 2 weeks for the ship to be temporarily repaired before she could limp her way back to Harland and Wolff in Belfast, where the Titanic was. As the insurance company concluded that the collision was the fault of the Olympic, this sent the White Star Line into financial turmoil as they were left to foot the bill. To fix the damage, they would have to almost split the Olympic in half to properly complete repairs, as well as pretty much rebuild sections of her. So the decision was made to swap the identities of both identical ships, sending Titanic out disguised as the Olympic and patching up the Olympic and to disguise her as Titanic. They planned to sink Olympic under the disguise of Titanic on her maiden voyage, with the arrangements that other ships around would be able to rescue every passenger on board. But as we all know, due to communication issues and mishaps, the plan didn't really work, resulting in 1,500 people perishing that night. However, Harland and Wolff did receive the insurance payout for the Olympic, disguised as Titanic, and they continued their operations. So I started off investigating this by writing down the following questions that I needed to answer to assess whether this whole swap theory was plausible or not. These 5 questions were: what exactly on board both ships needed to be changed and built? Was there enough time? How many people would need to be involved? What is the likelihood that they could all keep a secret? And was the White Star Line actually in financial turmoil due to the Olympic Hawke collision? And if so, was there any other way that they could have repaired Olympic without carrying out insurance fraud? So what exactly on both ships needed to be changed and built? In fact, there was a massive difference between both ships, and I'm ashamed I didn't realise until doing this investigation. I could always tell Titanic and Olympic apart from their outside appearance, but studying the floor plan for both ships, Deck A and B in particular, there is a massive interior difference. After Olympic was completed, it dawned on the White Star Line that they could increase revenue by changing the whole layout of B deck. So Harland and Wolff drew up the plans and they were agreed in July 1911. The changes involved replacing the starboard promenade with the Café Parisienne, extending the a la carte restaurant replacing the portside promenade, extending the galley and the pantry, with many additional first-class suites running down the port and starboard side of the ship, having multiple rooms and even a first-class private promenade area. On A deck, the promenade was slightly adjusted, the staff area skyline was changed, as well as other minor differences. A picture was taken at the beginning of October 1911, and it shows Olympic in the background limping back into Belfast after needing repairs after colliding with the Hawke. In the foreground, we can clearly see a very incomplete Titanic still being fitted out. The picture clearly shows that A deck and B deck were already under construction at this point, so the swap would have needed to involve the deconstruction of Titanic and the reconstruction to reflect the original Olympic layout and design, as well as the deconstruction to Olympic and the reconstruction to both decks, including all new ventilation systems, layouts, plumbing upgrades, and a whole new electrical circuit to accommodate for the new layout. Also, as discussed earlier, both ships were issued a yard number. Olympic was 400 and Titanic 401. On both ships, propeller blades, boilers, various engine parts, floorboards, wall paneling, tiles, signs, as well as many other different parts, and sometimes including the ship's name, engraved, printed, welded, and sewn into the items where easily visible. All of these would have ideally needed to have been exchanged from both ships. The ships' names were not painted on either. They were deeply engraved into the steel, so large plates would have needed to have been removed from the hull and again exchanged on both ships. And there were many minor items such as carpets, curtains, furniture, and other items which would have been different from ship to ship, and anything that wasn't standard White Star Line issue. And finally, as you can tell by the picture, the completion of the ship, including most of the interior, all 4 funnels, would have needed to have been fitted and installed, so an overwhelming amount of work was required to exchange the identities of both ships. Certainly possible if they had all the time in the world, but how much time did they exactly have? Was there enough time? To help build my understanding when investigating this, I constructed a timeline. A slight disclaimer, although I tried my utmost to gather accurate times and dates, archiving websites, newspapers and historians have slight differing records of some dates. Although I tried my best to detail the most reliable, there might be a slight confliction of information. The details will only be slight and in no way will it affect the point I will be trying to make. So referring to the timeline, at this point anything that happened before Olympic's collision with the Hawke is irrelevant in this conspiracy. Detailing the location of both ships during the time after the collision, we can see that the sisters were only together on 2 separate occasions before the Titanic sank. 2 weeks after the Hawk damaged Olympic, and again 5 months later when Olympic required a replacement propeller blade. Again, this was at Harland and Wolff. We can also rule out the second period for the swap taking place, as they were only together for around 8 days, and the swap would have already taken place before this point if the conspiracy theory has a chance to make sense. So that would mean that this period here would be the only logical time the swap could take place, and they were only together for a grand total of 44 days. That may seem like a relatively decent amount of time, but to put it into context, it took Olympic from being at this stage to at this stage a total of 7 months, with all the available resources. So how many people would have had to have been involved? For them to have had any realistic chance of carrying out this operation, they would have needed an absolute army of workers working around the clock, and they certainly would have needed both ships to have been berthed next to each other. Considering both ships would have needed the dry dock at the same time, means it would have been pretty unrealistic even with an army. Is it likely they could have kept it a secret? Everybody employed to conduct the swap, as well as the hundreds of people throughout the 44-day period working in and around the dock, would have clearly witnessed this change, and all would have been relied on to keep it secret. And remember, this includes arrangements over the pond for the collection of passengers whilst the ship was sinking, which was the end game. If they hadn't have arranged this and were simply chancing the 2,300 plus souls on board being rescued by someone else, that would have been beyond evil. And if that was the case, Mr. Andrews and Mr. Ismay would have probably had something to say about it before getting on board. So between 2005 and 2007, I worked on 2 ships, the Rodan and the Berlioz. The 2 ferries that continually sailed between Calais and Dover had some common traits with the Olympic-class sisters. Both the Sea France ships were the biggest cross-channel ferries at the time, they were both identical twins, and they were new ships in service with a year difference between them. Unlike Olympic and Titanic, they were almost exactly identical inside as well, with the exception of slightly different furniture, carpets, curtains, and certain restaurant and shop layouts and other intricate differences. I spent roughly 45 hours a week on that ship and slowly picked up the intricate and slight characteristics between both vessels. I have no shadow of doubt that if somebody had tried swapping the 2 ships, I would have almost instantly known walking onto the deck. And because of this, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that every member of crew walking onto Titanic and Olympic would have instantly known, or at least been suspicious throughout the voyage. The captain would have definitely known, and most certainly the officers. Keeping that secret would have been almost impossible. And if this was the case, what was the incentive for people keeping it secret, even during the Titanic trials afterwards? Did they pay everybody silencing money? And remember, the White Star Line were apparently in financial turmoil, and the additional work would not have been cheap. And in later years, surely people would have come out in their droves selling their stories detailing this period of time. And I highly suspect that after they've paid everybody off and they've conducted the swap successfully, they might as well have just paid for the darn repairs to the Olympic in the first place. Speaking of which, was the White Star Line in financial turmoil due to the Olympic and Hawk collision? If so, how could they have fully repaired Olympic without carrying out insurance fraud? This picture here was taken from a London Times article published shortly after the collision. White Star Line insisted they publish the picture to prove how unsinkable their ships were. That didn't age well. Anyway, they used it as a promotion, although this was highly embarrassing for the Admiralty. The conspiracy theory explains that the damage was so severe that the keel had been bent, meaning that she would fail any future Board of Trade inspection. To replace the keel, it would have been an expensive and time-consuming job. Thus the insurance fraud conspiracy was born. But looking into the investigation, it simply doesn't seem to ring true. As part of the process, there were 3 individual investigations conducted on the Olympic, an internal investigation by the White Star Line, one from the Admiralty, and one from the Board of Trade. All 3 investigations concluded that 2 major watertight compartments were flooded, the hull plating was gashed from the orlop deck to E deck, and the propeller shaft was also damaged. Not one of the investigations concluded that the keel was damaged, and the total cost of the repair was £55,000, and considering White Star Line experienced their highest profits year in 1911, earning almost £1 million, so I think it's safe to say that the White Star Line had this covered. So what is my conclusion? For the White Star Line swap conspiracy to hold any water, the following would have had to have happened. After the collision between Olympic and Hawk, White Star Line would have had 2 weeks to investigate and conclude the damage to Olympic and the cost needed to correct her. A plan would have needed to be formulated, assessed, discussed and agreed between the multiple owners of the company and Holland and Wolff, and the initial plan to swap both ships would have been devised. A large number of staff would have been carefully selected based on their individual skills and ability to keep a secret, as well as silencing money agreed, and these workers would have had approximately 44 days to deconstruct A and B deck of Titanic and install all the electrical, plumbing and ventilation in place up to that point, as well as deconstruct A and B deck on Olympic and repeating the process, completely stripping and installing the Titanic's designs, including first-class suites, Parisian cafe bar, a la carte restaurant, extending the kitchen and larder, installing all modifications onto the deck, take all of the items from Olympic and install them onto Titanic, replacing furniture, carpet, artwork and anything that was tailored for Titanic alone, swap all of Olympic items, continue the rest of the fitting of Titanic, including funnels, electrical, plumbing, ventilation, install hundreds of life jackets, change all the lifeboats, fit all the furniture, fill it with all the essential coal and water, which in some cases took 3 days, strip away the nameplates of both ships and swap them, which would have involved the hull being taken apart in several places, whilst replacing the propeller shaft of Olympic and completing all the patchwork, ensuring she's 100% seaworthy, passing all inspections. The Titanic would then complete Olympic service without any of the hundreds of Holland and Wolff workers, contractors and outside spectators seeing or suspecting a thing, doing such a fantastic job that no member of staff would suspect a thing on either ship. Send out Olympic as Titanic months later with some of the world's greatest athletes, celebrities and high-profile personnel, including members of the Holland and Wolff shipyard and the White Star Line, with the full intention of running her into an iceberg right at that moment, by lucky chance being in the right conditions, or for the sake of not repairing the keel, which 3 investigations found the keel was absolutely fine and explained to the world how they managed to repair something which didn't need repairing so quickly and so cheaply. And this isn't even mentioning the insurance implication and legality around all of this. I'm sorry, it didn't happen. So to anybody who watched my first episode would know, I was not sold on this conspiracy going into this, and I genuinely gave it my best chance. I tried to be as impartial as possible and just view the facts and sources. So my conclusion, or at least for now, is that there is no reasonable chance or reason this whole thing took place. But this will not stop me from revisiting Titanic. During my next Titanic investigation, I'll be looking into a coal fire on the Titanic, as well as corruption and the Illuminati. But for now, at least, although none of the conspiracies today I feel are plausible in any way, this doesn't take away from the fact that there are hundreds of different intricate mistakes, mishaps, assumptions, coincidences and circumstances that led to the Titanic being the world's most famous ship. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you've liked what you've seen, please like, share and subscribe, and thank you for watching.